Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 All right. So we can start to read chapter 3, and I'll tell you when to stop, where the idea finishes, and we can go to another one. Okay, so text 1. Go ahead and read from there.
All right, I'm in text 1. Okay, chapter 3, text 1. Okay, so we're not reading the Sanskrit, right? We're just reading the purport.
We just read in the English.
The English, okay. Okay. Translation. Arjuna said, O Janandana, O Keshava, why do you want to engage me in this ghastly warfare if you think that intelligence is better than fugitive work? What I do, go to do the purport?
No, just read the second verse.
Oh, okay. Second verse, translation. My intelligence is bewildered by your equivocal instructions. Therefore, please tell me decisively which will be most beneficial for me. Text 3. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, O sinless Arjuna, I have already explained that there are two classes of men who try to realize themselves. Some are inclined to understand it by empirical, philosophical speculation, and others by devotional service. Text 4. Not by merely abstaining from work can one achieve freedom from reaction, nor by renunciation alone can one attain perfection. Everyone is forced to act helplessly according to the qualities he has acquired from the moods of material nature. Therefore, no one can refrain from doing something, not even for a moment. Oh, man. Text 6. One who restrains the senses of action, but whose mind dwells on sense objects, certainly deludes himself, and is called a pretender. I don't know, did I skip text 5? No?
Everyone is forced to act according to qualities required from the mode of material nature. Then one can refrain from doing something, not even for a moment.
On the other hand, if a sincere person tries to control the active senses by the mind and begins Karma Yoga in Krishna consciousness without attachment, he is far superior. He is by far superior. perform your prescribed duties, for doing so is better than not working. One cannot even maintain one's physical body without work.
All right. All right. So hold there. All right. So it starts by him asking about the difference between intelligence and fruitive work, because he's saying, why are you engaging me in this ghastly warfare if you think that we can utilize intelligence to come to the right conclusion? So he says, my intelligence is bewildered. And now he's asking the Lord to tell me decisively which will be the most beneficial for him. So again, he's surrendering unto the Lord. And so the Supreme Lord explained that there are two classes of men. And they use either devotional service or empirical philosophical speculation. But then he goes on to say that we can't abstain from work, because you can't attain freedom from reaction. And if you stop working, you can't achieve freedom from reaction. And if you take the renunciation alone, you cannot attain perfection. So he's saying here that if you stop working, it's not going to help. It is going to be the same situation. All right, because no one in this world can stop working. But then if you stop working altogether, you still can't achieve perfection. So this is why he's engaging him in that ghastly warfare, because he has to perform his duty, and he can't just simply renounce it. Okay? So renunciation will not allow you to attain perfection. Okay, and Lloyd Prabhu, are you there?
Hey, Boris Prabhu, just a minute.
Yeah, I saw it. So if you're ready, we at text 6. All right, so
9, Pabuji. Text 9.
okay, we went down to 9. Okay, all right. Okay, just a minute here.
Yeah, I just came in the house and I just came straight out, so I haven't sorted myself out yet. I can probably listen in for now.
Okay. All right. So Varun is here. Varun Prabhu, please accept my obeisances. Glory to Prabhupada. And you can continue reading from text 9 of chapter 3.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, please accept my humble obeisances.
But I think just go ahead and when we see Jackson. Okay. Let's read over from text 6. It won't take that long.
Alright, text 6. One who restrains the senses of action, but whose mind dwells on sense objects, deludes himself and is called a pretender. On the other hand, the person tries to control the active senses by the mind and begins karma yoga in consciousness without attachment. He is by far superior. Perform your prescribed duty, for doing so is better than not working. One cannot even maintain one's physical body without work. Text 9. Work done as a sacrifice for Vishnu has to be performed. Otherwise, work causes bondage in this material world. Therefore, O son of Kunti, perform your prescribed duties for his satisfaction, and in that way you will always remain free from bondage. Text 10. In the beginning of creation, the Lord of all creatures sent forth generations of men and demigods, along with sacrifices for Vishnu, and blessed them by saying, be thou happy by this yajna, sacrifice, because its performance will bestow upon you everything desirable for living happily and happily. Text demigods being pleased by sacrifices will also please you, and thus by cooperation between men and demigods, prosperity will reign for all. Text 12. In charge of the various necessities of life, the demigods being satisfied by the performance of yajna, sacrifice, will supply all necessities to you. But he who enjoys such gifts without offering them to the demigods in return is certainly a thief. Text 13. The devotees of the Lord are released from all kinds of sins because they eat food which is offered first for the sacrifice. Others who prepare food for personal sense enjoyment verily eat only sin.
All right, you can hold that. So from text 9 through 13. Okay, so basically, it says your work done as a sacrifice of Vishnu has to be performed. So that's the kind of work we need to do, work done as a sacrifice of Vishnu. And work otherwise causes bondage in this material world. So it's a very difficult situation for many people to understand. But work for Vishnu, actually, and we can experience it, has that purifying quality. So he says, he's telling Arjuna, son of Kunti, perform your prescribed duties for his satisfaction. In that way you will always remain free from bondage. So he's explaining to him that work for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord is what he's talking about. Because he's talking about the difference between intelligence, acting intelligently, and acting, doing fruitive work. But here he's mentioning that fruitive work used in the service of the Lord is what will give us the proper action or the proper result. So then he goes on to talk about, in the beginning of creation, the Lord of all creatures sent forth men and demigods, along with sacrifices for Vishnu, and blessed them by saying, be thou happy by this yajna, because this performance will bestow upon you everything desirable for living happily and achieving liberation. So this is the method of happiness that's given. He's mentioning it here, that he sent forth generations of men and demigods, and he added the sacrifices of Vishnu. And then he blessed them by saying, be thou happy by this yajna. So this yajna is what we have to perform. So if we make our work yajna or activities yajna, then we will get everything desirable for living happily and for achieving liberation. So sometimes people think that you have to work very hard for material success. But if you are able to please the Lord, you will get the material success that you deserve. So it's necessary to perform that work. Now this chapter is called Karma Yoga, which is, work. So then he said, the demigods being pleased by sacrifices will also please you, and thus between cooperation between men and demigods, prosperity will reign for all. So that's the cooperation between men and demigods, utilizing the sacrifices for Vishnu. In that way, that work is able to release us from the difficult situations, and will also allow us to achieve liberation. So that sacrifice of Vishnu is what is necessary. Okay, and then on chapter 12, text 12, he said, in charge of various necessities of life, the demigods being satisfied by the performance of yajna will supply all necessities to you. And here he says, but he who enjoys such gifts without offering them to the demigods in return is certainly a thief. So all these things that are arranged and given by the demigods, we have access to it. So the fruits and the plants that we eat, they come from the moon god who makes these plants thrive. But if we are taking them and we're not offering them in return, we're just utilizing for ourselves. It's like we're stealing something that doesn't belong to us. So then he goes on to say, the devotees of the Lord are released from all kinds of sins because they eat food which is first offered for sacrifice. Others who prepare food for personal sense gratification, they eat only sin. So, food offered for sacrifice is what is necessary for us to satisfy the demigods, the Supreme Lord, and to take something that is purified of sinful reaction. Okay, alrighty. So text 14. So Lord Prabhu, are you ready to read, or did you want me to go ahead? Okay, I think he's still here. All right, so I'm going to read from 14 then. So here he says, all living bodies subsist on food grains, which are produced from rains. And rains are produced by the performance of yajna or sacrifice. And yajna is born of prescribed duties. 15. Regulated activities are prescribed in the Vedas, and the Vedas are directly manifested from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Consequently, the all-pervading transcendence is eternally situated in acts of sacrifice. My dear Arjuna, one who does not follow in human life the cycle of sacrifice thus established by the Vedas certainly leads a life full of sin, living only for the satisfaction of the senses. Such a person lives in vain. But one who takes pleasure in the self, whose human life is one of self-realization, and who is satisfied in the self only, fully satisfied, for him there is no duty. So, from 14 through 16, he's explaining about yajna. Rains, all living bodies subsist on food grains produced from rains. Rains are produced by the performance of yajna. So this is what happens. You know, people find sometimes there's no rain, and then fruits are not growing and plants are not growing. But there has to be some kind of yajna for this to happen. And this yajna is born of prescribed duties. So if we perform our prescribed duties, we will naturally perform the yajna that's necessary. So then regulated activities are prescribed in the Vedas. So that's where we get those regulated activities from. They're given by the Vedas. And then the Vedas are directly manifested from the personality of Godhead. So consequently, the all-pervading transcendent is eternally situated in acts of sacrifice. So then he says, my dear Arjuna, one who does not follow in human life the cycle of sacrifice thus established by the Vedas certainly leads a life full of sin, living only for the satisfaction of the senses. Such a person lives in vain. So he's mentioning here that most people are actually living in vain because they don't follow the cycle of sacrifice established by the Vedas. So in order to live properly, we have to follow the cycle of sacrifice established by the Vedas, because the Vedas are manifested directly by the personality of Godhead. All right, so Raghunath, then you can read from 17 onwards. And Lord Prabhu, when you are ready to read, you can tell me, okay?
Haribol 17. Okay. 17. But for one who takes pleasures in the self, but for one who takes pleasures in the self, whose human life is one of self-realization and who is satisfied in the self only fully satiated, for him there is no duty. Next 18. A self-realized man has no purpose to fulfill in the discharge of his prescribed duties, nor has he any reason not to perform such work, nor has he any need to depend on any other living being. Therefore, without being attached to the fruits of activities, one should act as a matter of duty. For by working without attachment, one attains the Supreme. Kings such as Janaka attain perfection solely by performance of prescribed duties. Therefore, just for the sake of educating the people in general, you should perform your work. Whatever action a good man performs, common men follow, and whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues.
All right, so stop there, 21. All right, so he's mentioning the one who takes pleasure in the self, whose human life is one of self-realization, who is satisfied in the self only, and is fully satiated. For him there is no duty. And the reason that there is no duty is because he has no material ambition, because he is satisfied in the self alone. Here he said the self-realized man has no purpose to fulfill in the discharge of his prescribed duties, nor has any reason not to perform such work, nor has he any need to depend on any other living being. So he depends solely on the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and he doesn't have to discharge his prescribed duties, but there's no reason for him not to work also. So then he's saying, without being attached to the fruits of activities, and this is how the self-realized man is, he is not attached to the fruits of activities. One should act as a matter of duty, for by working without attachment, one attains the Supreme. Because if we are not attached and we perform our duty according to our varna and ashram, then we are acting properly, but we are acting for the pleasure of the Supreme. Then he mentioned the king such as Janaka, the father of Sita, attained perfection solely by performance of prescribed duties. Therefore, just for the sake of educating the people in general, you should perform your work. Then again, he says, whatever action a great man performs, common men follow. Whatever standards he sets by his exemplary act, all the world pursues. So that means one has to work to give a good example to everyone. So we're going to give the proper example by working to please the Lord. All right. And okay, so Guru, you can continue from 22.
Yes, Guru. 22.
And before we go further, this verse 21, this is a famous verse. This is Yad Charity Sri Sash Tatta Devataro Jana Sayat Pamanam Kurute Lokastad Anuvartate. So that's Bhagavad Gita 3:21. That's one of the famous verses. All right, go ahead.
Yes, Guru. Text 22. O son of Parth, O son of Pritha, there is no work prescribed for me within all the three planetary systems, nor am I in want of anything, nor have I a need to obtain anything, and yet I am engaged in prescribed duty. Text 23. For if I ever fail to engage in carefully performing prescribed duties, O Parth, certainly all men would follow my path. If I did not perform prescribed duties, all these worlds would be put to ruination. I would be the cause of creating unwanted population, and I would thereby destroy the peace of all living beings. Text 25. As the ignorant perform their duties with attachment to results, the learned may similarly act, but without attachment, for the sake of leading people on the right path. Text 26. So as not to disrupt the minds of ignorant men attached to the punitive results of prescribed duties, a learned person should not induce them to stop work. Rather, by working in the spirit of devotion, he should engage them in all sorts of activities for the gradual development of Krishna consciousness. Text 27. The spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by the three modes of material nature. Text 28. One who is the knowledge of the absolute truth, O mighty arm, does not engage himself in the senses and sense gratification, knowing well the differences between work in devotion and work for fruitive results.
All right. So you can hold it. All right. So basically, he's saying that there is no work prescribed for me within all the three planetary systems. He says he doesn't want anything. He doesn't have a need to obtain anything, but yet he's engaged in prescribed duties. So, and the reason he's explaining is that if ever he failed to work, all men would follow his path. And if he did not follow his prescribed duties, did not perform prescribed duties, all the worlds would be put to ruination. And he would be the cause of creating unwanted population and would thereby destroy the peace of all living beings. So Krishna is saying here that he doesn't need to do any of these things, but he's doing it all the same. And the reason he's doing it is so that people will follow in his path. They will follow the proper example. So then he goes on to say that as the ignorant perform their duties with attachment to results, the learned may similarly attack, but without attachment for leading people on the right path. So basically, here he's saying that the purpose of acting properly is to lead people on the right path. Okay, and then on 26, which is a famous verse also, which is Na Buddhi Vedan Janayed agyanam karma sanginam joshayet sarva karmani vidvan yukta samacharan, and that is so as not to disrupt the minds of ignorant men attached to fruitive results of prescribed duties. A learned person should not induce them to stop work. Rather, by working in the spirit of devotion, he should engage them in all sorts of activities for the gradual development of Krishna consciousness. So basically, he's not telling people you're doing the wrong things. You know, if you can't get them to stop like meat eating, intoxication, you don't tell them, okay, you're doing the wrong thing, don't do this. But what he should do, by his work in the spirit of devotion, he should engage them in all sorts of activities, and that is for the gradual development of Krishna consciousness. So that some people come to the temple and they do a little service here and there. They wash some pots, they clean the yard, things like that. It's important that they do that to gradually develop Krishna consciousness. Then later on, as they get the proper intelligence by the mercy of the Lord, then they can actually begin to follow the regulated principles. Of course, we're not going to take someone who is not following the regulated principles and put him to worship the deity of the Lord. But there are different activities that he can perform. So this is important. We don't disrupt the minds of people who are attached to fruitive results of prescribed duties. And this is of prescribed duties. This is not all kinds of nonsense. So that we don't try to induce them to stop working, but we try to engage them properly. All right. So you read 20. Go ahead. Okay.
Hey, Krishna Prabhu.
Yeah. Are you ready?
Yes, please.
Okay.
I
So we
got a
read
read from
we
your
read 27 already, but I won't.
I have to read from your screen, Prabhu.
Can you see it?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
So read it from 28.
Read for 27. We read that already.
27. The spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actual carried out by the three modes of material nature. 28. One who is in knowledge of the absolute truth, almighty arm, does not engage himself in the senses and sense gratification, knowing well the differences between work in devotion and work for fruitful results. 29. Bewildering by the modes of material nature, the ignorant fully engage themselves in material activities and become attached. But the wise should not unsettle them, although these duties are inferior due to performers' lack of knowledge. 30. Therefore, O Arjuna, surrendering all your works unto me, with full knowledge of me, without desire for profit, with no claim of proprietorship, and free from lethargy, fight. 31. Those persons who execute their duties according to my injunctions and who follow this teaching faithfully, without envy, become free from the bondage of fruitive actions. 32. But those who, out of envy, disregard these teachings.
Okay, so from 27 to 31, it said the spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, he thinks himself the doer of activities that are actually carried out by the three modes of material nature. Now, how difficult is that for us to understand? We think we are the doer. We think that we are doing all these things. But basically, we are being carried forward by the modes of material nature. So if we didn't start one thing in one direction, we wouldn't be performing activities as we go along. So one who has knowledge of the absolute truth does not engage himself in the senses and sense gratification, because he knows well the differences between work in devotion and work for fruitive results. So this thing about the modes of material nature and the spirit soul thinking himself doer when he's actually not. So I mean, we all think that we are doing these activities, but the only activities that we really do are the ones in Krishna consciousness. The other activities are simply going along with our materialistic situation which we become attached to. So then, bewildered by the modes of material nature, the ignorant fully engage themselves in material activities and become attached. But the wise should not unsettle them, although these duties are inferior due to the performance lack of knowledge. And that again, that is the Bhagavad Gita 3:21, Na buddhi vedan janayad. So, bewildered by the modes of material nature, the ignorant fully engage themselves in and become attached. But the wise should not unsettle them. So he's saying that if one is wise, one should not disturb them, although these duties are inferior due to the performance of lack of knowledge. And then he tells Arjuna that you should surrender all your works to me with full knowledge of me, without desires for profit, with no claims to proprietorship, and free from lethargy and fight. So most times we are doing activities because of the result of sense gratification or economic development. Otherwise we won't do them. That's why we are doing this work. But he's saying here, surrender all your works to me with full knowledge of me. And he says, without desires for profit, with no claims to proprietorship, and free from lethargy. So you do it with full enthusiasm. You don't do it, well, I have to do this, so I'm just going to take my time and do it. He says, do it like if you're attached. And in that way you fight. So those persons who execute their duties according to my instructions, who follow this teaching faithfully without envy, become free from the bondage of reactions. So and this is another famous verse. Yemi matamidam nityam anutishtanti manava swalavanto na suyanto muchante tepi karmabhi. So those persons who execute their duties according to my injunctions and follow this teaching faithfully without envy become free from the bondage of actions. Now the karma means, the work that we perform. So what we are trying to do is to perform activity so that it will not bind us to this material world. All right, so from 32, all right, so Raghunandan, you can read from 32.
Okay, Haribol 32. But those who are out of envy, disregard these teachings and do not follow them regularly are to be considered bereft of all knowledge, be fooled and ruined in their endeavors for perfection. Even a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature, for everyone follows the nature that he has acquired from the three moods. What can repression accomplish? What can repression accomplish? Before, there are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and the object. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they are stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. "25. It is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties even though faultily than others' duties perfectly. Destruction in the course of performing one's own duty is better than engage in another's duty, or to follow another path is dangerous."
All right, so stop there. There's a different idea coming up here now. Okay, so he says the one who disregards these teachings, and that's out of envy. He's saying out of envy they disregard these teachings and do not follow them, are considered to be bereft of knowledge, befooled, and ruined in their endeavors for perfection. So then he goes on to say that even a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature. For everyone follows the nature he has acquired from the three modes. And what can repression accomplish? So we can't stop that activity. We have to act in that way. Now he said there are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and their objects. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they are stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. So this thing here is the attachment and the aversion. These are the stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization, not the work itself, but the attachment and the aversion. So then he says it is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties, even though faultily, than another's duties perfectly. Destruction in the course of performing one's duty is better than engaging in another's duties, for to follow another's path is dangerous. So he's saying that Arjuna is a Kshatriya, and he should not try to follow the example of the activities of a sadhu. Because if he just dies as a Kshatriya, he will either get the heavenly planets, or he will, if he doesn't die and he wins the battle, he will get a kingdom on the earth. But if he tries to follow somebody else's path, then what happens is he doesn't know what's going to happen. So he's mentioning to him that it is far better to describe one's prescribed duties even though you're not doing it properly. Alright, so from text 36, Varun Prabhu, you want to read from text 36?
Arjun said, "O descendant of Vishnu, by what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force?" Text 37. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "It is lust, Arjun. It is born of contact with the material mode of passion and later transformed into wrath, and which is all devouring sinful enemy of this world." 38. As fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, or as an embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. 39. Thus the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. Text 40. The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity, and bewilders them. 41. Therefore, O Arjun, best of the Bharatas, in the very beginning curb this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. Text 42. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. Text 43. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence, O mighty armed Arjun, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust.
All right. All right, so here from 36 to 43, he's explaining what lust is. And he says lust is born of passion, and it's transformed into wrath, and it's actually the sinful enemy of this world. And this is in answer to the question, by what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? So some people can't help themselves, but it is because of lust, which is born of the mode of passion, later transformed into wrath, and which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of the world. So there's different stages of this lust. Fire covered by smoke, a mirror covered by dust, and the embryo covered by the womb. Fire covered by smoke is easy to get rid of. A mirror covered by dust takes a little endeavor to scrub the mirror, and the embryo covered by the womb is practically in a helpless state. So these are explanations of this lust and how it covers the living entity. Now, here he says the senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust. So this is where lust sits. And so he says to Arjuna in the beginning, curb this great symbol of sin by regulating the senses. So if one regulates the senses, he will automatically regulate the mind, and then the intelligence will become purified, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. So this is a very practical example of how it's done. So we curb this great symbol of lust by regulating the senses. That's the first thing we do. Then we can slay the destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. Then he goes on to say that the working senses are superior to dull matter, and mind is higher than the senses, and intelligence is still higher than the mind, and the soul, the Atma, is higher than the intelligence. So he says, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence, O mighty Arjuna, one should study the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. So this is the end of this chapter, which is called Karma Yoga, and it focuses on activity all throughout. So in the beginning, 1 through 8, Arjuna is asking why, you're telling me about intelligence and fruit of work. You're actually confusing me. So devotional service and empirical philosophical speculations, Krishna explains, are the two paths that people can take. But if you take to renunciation alone, you will not achieve perfection. So then he tells him, perform your prescribed duties, for one cannot even maintain his body without physical work. So Arjuna is asking about intelligence and fruit of work. So he's wondering why he should perform this activity. So here in these first 8 chapters, he's explaining that. So does anyone have any more explanation on that, or any kind of realization coming out of those first 8 verses? All right, so the 9 through 10 begins with work done as a sacrifice for Vishnu has to be performed. So then he's saying to perform your prescribed duties for his satisfaction, and in this way you will always remain free from bondage. It's the only way to get free from bondage, to perform your activities, your prescribed duties for the satisfaction of the Lord. And then in chapter 10, text 10, sorry, that's also a famous verse. It's in the beginning of creation, the Lord of all creatures sent forth generations of men and demigods, along with sacrifices for Vishnu. So he didn't just send forth men and demigods, but he sent them along with sacrifices for Vishnu. And then he blessed them by saying, "Be thou happy by this yajna, because its performance will bestow upon you everything desirable for living happily and achieving liberation." So, performing these prescribed duties in the proper way, we can live happily and we can achieve liberation. So some people think, the Mayavadis think that you can't be happy in this life, otherwise you're in Maya. But you can be happy by performing activities for the pleasure of the Lord. That's the real happiness. Then he goes on to say that the demigods, now they are pleased by the sacrifices, they will also please you, and thus by cooperation between men and demigods, prosperity will reign for all. So in charge of the various necessities of life, the demigods, being satisfied by the performance of yajna, will supply all necessities to you, but he who enjoys such gifts without offering them to the demigods is certainly a thief. So now he introduces a different idea. He's telling us to perform these duties, and when we perform those duties, then the demigods will become pleased. And by that pleasure, there's a cooperation between men and demigods, and prosperity will reign for all, not only for the men, but for the demigods also. So, here he's saying, because the demigods are in charge of the various necessities of life, and they are satisfied with the performance of yajna, they will supply all necessities. But then he says, but he who enjoys such gifts without offering them to the demigods in return is certainly a thief. So he's introducing a different idea, whereby we have to perform this sacrifice in order to satisfy the demigods. So we don't want to become a thief. And he said the devotees of the Lord are released from all kinds of sins because they eat food which is first offered for sacrifice. Others who prepare food for personal sense enjoyment verily eat only sin. So we are not here on this planet Earth simply to maintain ourselves, but we are here to serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So if we think we are just maintaining ourselves, we have an incomplete idea of what's happening. So in 14 through 16, all living beings subsist on food grains, and these are produced from rains, and rains are produced by the performance of yajna. And yajna is born of prescribed duties. So here he goes on to say that these regulated activities, they're prescribed in the Vedas, and the Vedas are directly manifested from the Personality of Godhead. So all this yajna is coming directly from the Personality of Godhead. So he says, consequently, the all-pervading transcendence is eternally situated in acts of sacrifice. And then he says, one who does not follow in the human life the cycle of sacrifice just established by the Vedas certainly leads a life full of sin, living only for the satisfaction of the senses. Such a person lives in vain. And how is it that he lives in vain? Some people are successful, but the thing about that success is it's finished at the end of life. But if you work for the pleasure of the Supreme Lord, whatever you do, whatever result that you get, that you can take from this life to the next life, and that can also take you to the spiritual world. So, what if one takes pleasure in the self, and as human, whose human life is one of self-realization? So the self here is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and self-realization means that we should try to understand who we are and who God is, and who is satisfied in the self only, fully satiated. For him there is no duty. So at that point in time, if one is on that platform, he doesn't really have any activity to perform. And then he goes on to say that a self-realized man has no purpose to fulfill in the discharge of his prescribed duties, nor has he any reason not to perform such work, nor has any need to depend on any other living being. Here he is depending solely upon the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and he performs his activity for the pleasure of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So then he says, without being attached to the fruits of activities, one should act as a matter of duty, for by working without attachment, one attains the Supreme. And then he mentions that King such as Janaka attained perfection solely by prescribed duties. And he says, for the sake of educating people in general, you should perform your work. So if you perform the right activity, and people see that, and they follow that, then they will benefit. So he says that whatever action a great man performs, common men will follow. Whatever standard he sets by his exemplary act, all the world will pursue. So this is given in 7 to 21, and 21 is that yad yada charity shresthat tad tadeva taro jana sayat pamanan kurute lokastad anuvartate. All right. So then from 22 to 26, Krishna is setting the example that he works even though he doesn't need to work. He says, there's no work prescribed for me, nor am I in want of anything, nor have a need to obtain anything, and yet I'm engaged in prescribed activities. He says, for if I fail to engage in carefully performing duties, all men would follow in my path. If he didn't perform prescribed duties, all the world will be put to ruination, and he would be the cause of creating unwanted population, and would thereby destroy the peace of all living beings. So here he mentions creating unwanted population, and that destroys the peace of all living beings. Because the unwanted population, they don't follow properly the jagyas, the activities of Krishna consciousness or of the Varnashram, and they don't know how to act. And that's why everything is becoming so not peaceful. So then he says that the ignorant perform their duties with attachment to results. The learned may similarly act without attachment for the sake of leading people on the right path. So we have a reason to act properly, and that is leading people on the right path. And then 26 is Na buddhi vedam janayed joshayet sarvakarmani, so as not to disrupt the minds of ignorant men, attached to fruitive results. We should work in the spirit of devotion and engage them in the proper activities for the gradual development of Krishna consciousness. So by them following our activity, by them having respect for us and helping us in the practice of Krishna consciousness, that helps them. So sometimes we have a service to perform, and we can get someone to help us in that service. If we get them to help us in that service, they are actually gradually elevated in Krishna consciousness. So 27 to 31 is talking about the spirit soul bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by the three modes of material nature. And the reason that they're carried out by the three modes of material nature is because we become attached to material activities. And by that attachment, we are following the material nature, the modes of material nature. So, bewildered by those modes, the ignorant fully engage themselves in material activities and become attached. Then again, he says the wise should not unsettle them, although these duties are inferior due to the performer's lack of knowledge. So, really and truly, we should give knowledge to others, but we should do it in the most pleasant and acceptable manner. We shouldn't point fingers at them saying, "You're doing something which is incorrect," because no one will follow us if we do that. So then Arjuna, he says, surrendering all your works to me, with full knowledge of me, without desires for profit, with no claim to proprietorship, and free from lethargy, fight. So he's saying we should do our activity with full enthusiasm, without the desires for profit, with no claim to proprietorship. And in that way, we can please the Lord. So those who execute their duties according to his injunctions and follows this teaching faithfully without envy, they become free from the bondage of fruitive activities. But out of envy, if they disregard these teachings, they are bereft of all knowledge, befooled and ruining in their endeavors for perfection. And then he goes on to say, as far as work is concerned, even a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature. Yeah. And everyone follows the path he has acquired from the modes of material nature. So, then there are principles to regulate attachment and aversion to the senses. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they are stumbling blocks. So these are the stumbling blocks. And then he mentions that it's far better to describe one's prescribed duties than to follow the duties of another. So if we have a duty that's prescribed for us, and in this case we are not strictly following Varnashram, but our duties are coming through the parampara, down to the disciples, the GVCs, everybody coming down to us. We should be able to follow that and prescribe those duties. Even though we think that we're not doing them right, but we shouldn't think we should be doing something else. This is what Krishna has arranged for us. So then Arjuna asks about how one is impelled to sinful acts, and the progression is there, and it says lust. And that verse 37 is Kama Esha Krodha Esha Rajaguno Samadbhava Mahashano Mahapapma Vidhi Enam Iha Varinam. And that is, it says it's lust only, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion and later transformed into wrath, and which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of the world. So that 337 is another famous verse. Okay. And then he goes on to explain how lust bewilders the person. All right. And finally, he ends up by saying the working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is higher than the mind. And the soul is higher than the intelligence. So he says, knowing oneself to be the soul, transcendental to the material senses, mind and intelligence, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. So that's the end of the 3rd chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Anyone would like to make any comments or ask any questions or give some realizations?
One question, kind of comment also. In this chapter, Lord Krishna, he said that we are forced to work, that is for sure. And then not only that, we are, it's our material modes or our nature basically, which is the doer, which is forcing us to act in this manner. And then it's actually lust, which is, Arjun asked and Lord Krishna said it's basically lust, which is impelling us to do these sinful activities. And then the other thing is that it's like, if we are able to, so one thing is, one motivation for doing work could be these material modes, the material mode, the figurative results, or all the sinful lust. One can see those are the motivation. The other motivations could be which is sacrifice and which is trying to please the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So it seems like the real difference is between these two motivations. Like if you make your motivation for pleasing the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and you try to look at everything in that aspect, then I think is like you can be liberated. You can be, at least you can avoid this bondage of work, because otherwise it's like the work is constantly keeping you bonded, because the material mode just keeps on reinforcing. The lust will keep reinforcing through and through. So you'll work, you will get some result, and then it'll just cause you to be more greedy, and like that cycle will continue. So it seems like it's only at is it possible to reimagine? I mean, even if you're, when you're like doing your work in your job and other things, that you can try to start looking at it as, I'm trying to do this for Lord Krishna, so that you can be free yourself more and more from bondage. Is that possible? Or yeah, Prabhuji, you are on mute. I don't know if you... Prabhuji, I don't know if I can't hear you, or I don't know if you're saying.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was muted, because when I'm not muted, I don't hear you clearly. Yeah. So basically, the last two verses, 42 and 43, will give the method. And knowing oneself to be transcendental to material senses, mind, and intelligence, one should study the mind by deliberate intelligence, which is called Krishna consciousness, and by spiritual strength conquer the insatiable enemy known as lust. And then he gives us the reason or the method by which to do it, by performing yajna for the pleasure of the demigods. Now, we don't work for the pleasure of the demigods, we work for the pleasure of the Supreme Lord, and just by watering the root of the tree, everyone else, all the twigs and branches, they're satisfied. So the demigods will be satisfied there. All right? So that's the way to work, to become happy in this material world, and to come to the point of self-realization. But what he's saying is that this lust is where the problem is, because it's based on attachment to material nature. So that's a good observation. Anyone has anything that they'd like to say? Lloyd Prabhu, Raghunandan? I was remembering. Go ahead.
No problem. No problem.
Okay. All right, and Raghunandan, do you have anything that you got from this entire reading?
Haribol. No, not. Yeah, I got some of them, but that's okay, Babuji. That's all right.
You weren't paying attention all the way through. Is that what's happening? You had other things.
Right, I drop asleep there, Babuji.
Oh,
I doze off a little bit.
All right.
I doze off.
What you can do is you can always listen to the recording. All right. And the recording is on YouTube. You can listen to it, and you can hear the entire thing again. All right, and then I will do the notes. I have to listen to the recording all over again and write the notes and then put them on the system. Okay, but you can always go over these, and if at that point in time you find anything that you wanted to discuss, you're welcome to write it down and then bring it up in the next meeting. All right. All right, so at this point in time, we can. All right, at this point in time, we can stop here and then Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Hari Premanand.
Haribol.
Hari Bol.